Okay, so this is our last reading for the week, and in the previous reading, we focused on the inequalities that exist within our public education, and this reading focuses on the elite prep school system. Prep schools are private schools, but are even more privileged than regular private schools. These schools are part of that enclosure movement that I referenced during the Collins lecture. This book, or the book from which these chapters are taken, is called Preparing for Power, and it focuses much of its attention on the select 16 prep schools. Cookson and Persell identified these select 16 schools as the most prestigious schools within the prep school system based on surveying people who were familiar with prep schools. They, in essence, were asked to rank schools, and from that survey, the select 16 were identified by that population. What you'll see here is that these schools provide an exceptional educational experience for their children, which in turn prepares them for entry into exceptional, highly selective colleges and universities, and which ultimately are also linked to where they wind up professionally as adults. Mhm. So Cookson and Purcell conducted their research in the 1990s, and at that time, very little work had existed about the elite prep school system. In part, they argued that this is due to the fact that the very existence of these prep schools goes against the fundamental ideals of democracy and equality of opportunity. The students who attend prep schools are expected to become leaders of organizations and government officials in our society. Prep school students learn social roles and behaviors that shape students' lifestyles and life chances. The founders of these schools were keenly aware of their and their children's class location and attended these schools to cultivate a class of individuals who would become the leaders of our society. Flash forward, and 25 years from the publication of this book, and these schools are now recruiting students globally, but the premise still holds. These children will be expected to become tomorrow's leaders. Cookson and Purcell conducted their work, and they were pleasantly surprised at how much access they had to the schools, the students, and the teachers and the counselors. The only area that they did not have access to was when the admissions committees were making their decisions about who they would admit into their schools. Cookson and Purcell, the sociologists who conducted this research, were not privy to those conversations. But they did learn, but what they did learn was that the vast majority of children admitted into these prep schools actually came from families who had also attended these or other prep schools. So the Marxist position is a position that fits neatly under the conflict theory framework, especially under the tenet that those that benefit from the current structure want the current structure to be maintained, because they benefit from them. Marxists know that the prep schools undermine the revolutionary spirit of the working class, and that prep schools, while most prep schools admit students who come from families who also attended prep schools, they also will admit students whose families come from new wealth. And they will offer scholarships to people who are not of the same class, but who have captured the attention of the elite as someone with exceptional talent and skill. Those on scholarship are screened or recruited and allowed to enroll in the prep schools. And upon undergoing a rigorous applications process that usually requires an interview, and if selected, these people get invited to be part of the prep, or to have the prep school experience. And by doing so, they develop relationships with the elite and are potentially integrated into the elite. Thus, the prep school sucks up from the ableist elements of the lower classes, people who had the potential to also be the brains of the working class. These people who are on scholarship and who participate in the prep school system are the new brains of the elite. At the same time, they weaken the potential future leadership for the working class. This ensures the security of the elite's class location. They, unlike the rest of us, are quite class conscious. They send their kids to these schools as a strategy that enhances the preservation of their class privilege. I'd like to encourage you to watch the video that I posted in this folder. It's about 8 or 9 minutes long, but you can see how qualitatively different the educational experience is at one of these select 16 schools. These prep schools are what have been called total institutions, and by that, Cookson and Purcell mean that the child's schooling experience occurs in a completely controlled environment. They live on campus, and the rhythms of their daily lives are structured by the prep school. And in living their lives on these campuses, they come of age here, developing really strong bonds and relationships with the people they are with. Their lifestyles and habitus are shaped, and these experiences have real implications for their futures in higher education and thereafter. These total institutions are not cheap. Most students live on campus and attend these schools from the 9th through the 12th grade. This was their annual tuition a couple of years back. This annual tuition exceeds the median household income for nearly or more than half, actually, of the population in the United States, for nearly half of the households in the United States. They don't make that much money to live off of. So going to a school like this may not even seem fathomable. What's more, many people don't even know that these types of schools exist, but they do exist, and they continue to, and they'll continue to be linked to elite institutions of higher education and other major organizations and governmental entities when they're done with their schooling. In observing and talking with prep school students, the Cookson and Parcell note that there was no escape for these students within these total institutions. They were isolated from their natural environments, and by that they mean they were isolated from their family and from their communities. These kids were often sent away to school, and they lived in close proximity with other students, so they had to live their lives and navigate their education, their parents, the school's expectations, and their peers' evaluations day in and day out. Cookson and Purcell talked about this triangle of tension that existed among the students, the school, and the parents. Students had to master challenging curriculum and manage their experiences with their peers. For just as in public schools, peer evaluations are also important to a student's social status. Couple that with having to navigate their parents' expectations. In some instances, these children are from legacy families and who want their children to continue their education at prestigious, highly selective colleges and universities. And the schools need to help students navigate the expectations of their parents and of themselves, as well as of the school. For these schools, legitimacy is also predicated on their ability to get students into those highly selective schools. And with so much at stake, these youth need to master the curriculum, master the extracurricular activities, perform well on standardized tests, and the college application process, all amidst their peers. There is no hiding. Thus, students must manage their own vulnerability, manage their insecurities, the challenges, the triumphs, the tribulations, the parents' own ambitions. And all of this helps cement a certain kind of elite class consciousness, because all of the youth at these schools are navigating these things collectively. The schools were founded to mold and shape the child in a particular way, and through that experience they develop a collective identity. As a total institution, the schools create these opportunities for repetitive encounters and rites of passage that translate into a type of group loyalty that maximizes long-term support for these prep schools. Andover, the one that's in that video that I recommended, is a high school and has over $1 billion endowment, a high school. And in part, it's because of those connections that the families make. And Cookson and Purcell call these schools status seminaries, because the experience at the prep school cultivates the child in a certain way, helping them to develop a habit of command. This expectation that they will be leaders. The staff that allows for the functioning of these prep schools is largely invisible, and as a function of their living in their environment, and in that environment, students acquire a certain kind of taste and a set of cultural practices. These schools are timeless and transmit a sort of high culture, a genteel flair, all out of the vision of the rest of us. And I'd like to show you some pictures of Andover Academy to illustrate my point. There is a classic timeless beauty at the schools coupled with state-of-the-art educational resources that allow students to be prepared for entry into highly selective, highly competitive institutions of higher education. In this slide, you'll see the campus of Andover on the top left and the study hall on the top right. At the middle right, you see the high school art museum right here. Right. On the bottom left and bottom center, you see the Gelb Science Center. That's the square building with lots of windows, and at the top of the building is their observatory. In this slide, you see beautiful grounds, the timeless classic architecture, coupled with the state-of-the-art science facilities for these high school students, right, really connects them to the history and their membership as being part of this exclusive community, but also preps them for the future, right? Again, more facilities on the campus. Here at the top left is their theater, where the schools put on school plays, right? And their concerts and performances. The top right is their dining facilities, and the middle left is a dining hall. The last three pictures are pictures of their sports facilities. This is all for a campus that has less than 1,200 students, with about 900, I think it's 875 boarding, and a little over 300 who are just, daytime students. In chapter 9, the authors address the issue of getting into the right college and university. They talk about students' aspirations to go to prestigious colleges and universities. Everyone's expected to go to college, anticipates going to college. It's actually which college you're going to get into that's important. Now, prior to World War II, going to one of the select 16 prep schools virtually guaranteed students admissions into an Ivy League college. But since World War II, admissions, especially into the Ivy Leagues, is not a guarantee. Prep school students have thus expanded their list of what constitutes a good school, though the list remains really narrow. The odds of children being able to get into the highly selective, highly competitive, even Ivy League schools is quite good compared to the rest of us. So with the increased competition, the question becomes, where does one of these students go to college or university? And for many of these children, a good college is either an Ivy League school or a highly selective school. And in part, this is due to the fact that the list of good schools they aspire to go to have what are called legacy admissions programs. And what that is basically is that when you're submitting your application to the college, you can tell them, I have documentation that I'm a member of this family or I've attended this school, and I would like my application to be considered under the legacy admissions policy. And students who get reviewed under legacy admissions policy actually tend to have better odds at getting accepted to the school compared to like the open admissions policy or the regular admissions policy. And so those students can get preferential treatment because they had family members who went to the schools. But those colleges also, right, have a history and well-established relationship with the prep schools themselves. And this too shapes the outcomes for those prep school students. Recall in the Regal and Crum piece from the functionalist unit, I talked about how college counselors are really important for non-Hispanic females in order to increase their likelihood of going to a four-year university. Well, the importance of counselors for the prep school student is also really important, but this relationship is a given and is centered on students getting into highly selective, highly competitive colleges and universities. These prep school counselors are part of the experience of prep school. The prep school counselor extensively engages with the prep school student. And there's this organized timeline for students that begins in the 9th year and that carries through their senior year. Students and their parents are expected to complete written materials. The counselors do interviews with their parents and with the students about their aspirations and expectations, and they provide important biographical background information of the family and of the child. The counselors also do interviews with the teachers. They keep extensive notes for and on the students, so that when it comes time for applications to the Ivy League schools or the highly selective schools, these students can have very detailed, personalized letters of recommendation for the students. And that translates into real advantages when it comes to admissions committees making decisions about their freshman class. Additionally, Ivy League schools send recruiters regularly down to the select 16 prep schools. So there's this stable, persistent connection between the prep school and the Ivies. On top of that, the academic advisors who work at the prep schools have long-term relationships with each other and with the Ivy League schools and with the highly selective colleges and universities. Cookson and Persell even talked about how these long-term relationships with colleges and universities and with other prep school counselors allow prep schools to modify their practices that resulted in better admissions results for their prep school students. Having conversations with other prep school counselors, the counselors learned that the class ranks were problematic for their lower ranked students. So they collectively, among these schools, prep schools, they collectively decided to no longer um, provide the class rank of their students. So they just stopped doing it. They rationalized that the quality of education their students were experiencing at their select 16 schools was different and more rigorous than most other educational experiences. And so to rank the students was in essence unjust and harmful for those students. They further decided that they would only offer general rankings when pushed to do so by admissions committees. And in the end, that move helped their students with their admission rates into the colleges of their choice. Moreover, Cookson and Purcell learned that the academic advisors from the prep schools were often invited to participate in the admission process at Ivy League schools. There, the counselors could advocate for their students in a way that public school college counselors just didn't have the means or the time or the connections to do so. This again gave prep school students a real advantage in the admissions process. Additionally, the Ivy League schools actually had color-coded folders for each of the prep schools, so the admissions committee would know just by looking at the folder if the student came from one of those special prep schools. So again, we're looking at a fundamentally different educational experience, not just in terms of curriculum, but in terms of educator relationships with students and with admissions committees at the most prestigious and most selective institutions across the country. And this is in part this is part of the social organization of our education system. We have multiple types of education systems for people from different social classes, and that translates into having a variety of odds, um, you know, of getting into the most competitive schools across the country. What I want you to pay attention to in this table is the header along the top where it says that the students are grouped by SAT scores. High scores, right, in the first column here, medium scores, and low scores. You have one column for the select 16, right? And then one column for the other leading preps under each of those categories. Now, if you look along the side of the table, you see the percent of students accepted. You'll see that it says the percent of students accepted in the Ivy League college and accepted at the most highly selective colleges, right? And so, and then if you look across the row right here, you see the percent of students accepted into the Ivy Leagues and the other highly selective schools from these prep schools. The admission rates are extremely high, especially when one considers that the admission rates for those really selective schools are often less than 10%. Notice those with the high SATs had a 66% acceptance rate. For the middle group, it was still 39%, and for the low, it was almost 20%. And the admissions rates were even higher at the highly selective institutions. Whereas a public school student with a mediocre or low SAT score, they wouldn't even dream of applying to an Ivy League. But you had prep school students doing so and still getting in at pretty remarkable rates considering how competitive those schools are. Now, look at these data that I pulled from the US News and World Report ranking for the 2020-2021 school year. First, look at the tuition for these colleges and universities in this column here, right? It's very similar to the tuition for the prep schools. So if you think about it, families can expect to spend about $500,000 on their children's high school and undergraduate education combined. The cost of this type of education alone would cause most people pause, even if their children were to be accepted into one of these schools. Next, look at the acceptance rates here. I want you to think about, right, like all of these are at the single digit marks except for Johns Hopkins, but I want you to think about the acceptance rates from the previous slide, right? Especially this one right here. You can see their acceptance rates are 66% for the Select 16 and then 45% for the other leading prep schools. And again, overall though, you're looking at here, there's acceptance rates are in the single digits. Now, I want you to look at the range of SAT scores. Now, these are the students' scores for their verbal and quantitative tests combined, the verbal and math tests combined. A perfect score on those two tests, on those two components combined is 1600. The national average was 1059. Now, if you lined up the admitting class coming into the university, if you lined up the students by lowest SAT score all the way to highest SAT score, and you looked at the range of scores in the middle 50%, their score ranges are 1460 to 1570. And I mean, in most of those, some of them are even higher, 1510 or 1530 to 1560. So near perfect. And they're just in the average location, right, for that admissions group. People who get these kinds of scores have had an enriching educational curriculum throughout their life course. They've had well-trained teachers and ample opportunities to be exposed to concepts and language. And when you look at the disparities in education by the quality of environments, just by social class, you can see how the current social organization of our school system, an education system that allows 4 layers of nested inequalities within public schools, that exist within nested inequalities within neighborhoods for public schools, and allows for exceptionally wealthy families to create educational opportunities for their children that few can even dream of, much less have the opportunity to see and know exist. We can see how the way that the education system in the United States is currently organized actually legitimates and reproduces the inequality that already exists in our broader society, and that how education may indeed be transformational and have an impact on individual students' lives, but it does really nothing to transform the inequalities that exist in our broader society. Those remain there. Okay, we're going to stop there. This is the last reading. You have no exam this week. When we move on to the next section, we're going to be looking at education related to race. And then we're also going to be looking at the content of curriculum, specifically as it connects to US history, the US history that's taught in high school. Okay, that's it.